Greetings, salve, aloha. Thank you for that generous introduction, and many thanks to ISFNR President Sadna Naitani and the EC for inviting me to participate in this lecture series entitled Voices from Around the Globe. I speak with you today from Honolulu, Hawaii, and my talk is grounded in what I've learned and am still learning from Native Hawaiians, their stories, their islands. I grew up an Anglo-Indian Italian in Rome, Italy, and came to Hawaii, an occupied and colonized nation in the US, close to 40 years ago. Though I knew nothing about oceanic oratures, based on my academic credentials, I was hired to teach oral narratives and folklore and literature at the university. My research was on Euro-American folk and fairy tales and their retellings, and it would take quite a while for me to find out that Hawaii had its own interesting relationship to the fairy tale, including 19th century translations of the Grimm Cinderella and tales from the Arabian Nights. Over the years, the experience of being a woman and a settler of color in Hawaii, who seeks to be an active ally for Hawaiian sovereignty and social justice, has not only shaped my personal and scholarly trajectory, but has also demanded that I continue to revisit my understandings of folklore, narrative cultures, genres, and disciplinary boundaries. While raising questions of recognition, translation, or transcoding, genre, and justice, my talk today has two parts. In the first, I draw on the work of and collaborations with Hawaiian religion scholar Marie Alohalani Brown and Hawaiian literature scholar Ku'ualoa Ho'omanawanui, as a way to reflect on how I got to my current approach to fairy tales as wonder tales, which I discuss in the second part of my talk. Let me begin by retelling the story of Kiowai o Honokawailani, which was told orally and then published in Hawaiian by Sarah Kili'ilolena Nākoa. Translated by Maria Lohalani Brown as The Mermaid of Honokawailani Pond, it does not start with Once Upon a Time or an equivalent formula. Nākoa introduces the tale by noting how she was raised in Ewa on the west side of Oahu and was familiar with the pond, and that her grandmother told her the story while combing young Sarah's very long hair. The tale's protagonist, a young woman whose beauty was well known throughout Ewa, also had very long hair that nearly reached her feet, made shiny with coconut oil and fragrant with perfume. One day, after being out with friends, she didn't return home. The search for her was unsuccessful. Then in her sleep, her mother heard the girl saying, "Honokawailani." And so she went to this beautiful and deep pond looking for her. When she saw her daughter among the water lilies, the woman tearfully asked her to return home, where she would once again comb her long hair, but the girl shook her head forcefully. Then a young man appeared next to her and, quote, the young woman waved goodbye to her mother and then jumped up high so that her mother could see the answer to her questions and thus not feel sad. Behold, a fishtail had replaced her legs. She was a mermaid, and this boy, he was her daughter's sweetheart. Sarah Nākoa concludes her tale, and there she is until this day, said my grandmother. I'll briefly share how the short Hawaiian narrative and its framing in Hawaiian and Indigenous studies terms have helped me retrain my folklorist imagination. It is significant that the Hawaiian language title identifies not the protagonist, but the vahipana or storied place where she was transformed. The information about Honokabailani as a body of water is very specific, placing it in an ahupua'a, a land division, usually extending from the uplands to the sea of Baiao, one that was well known to the teller and to the peoples of Eba. In Sarah Nakoa's translated words, this pond was full of water from beneath the earth. When it was high tide, the fresh water of Honokabailani rose like that of the sea and became a stream. The water was dark, a dark blue-green, until the sun hit it, and then it became transparent. The pond was thick with water lilies on every side, and here and there within it, its lushness was striking. It was the meeting place for all the youths, from Waimalu to Manana, when I was a child. I would go to Honokabailani to swim and play in the water. End of quotation. Honokabailani then was a place where waters met and young people enjoyed themselves. Its waters welcomed play as well as reflection, and their depth and lilies cover offered seclusion. Either way in the story, the surface of the pond is a threshold or portal to another world. And the tale, Kekio Bai o Honokabailani, is a meeting place for species and narrative cultures. Unlike mo'o, lizard or reptilian shapeshifters and reptilian water deities, mermaids are not common in Hawaii or in Hawaiian storytelling, but they are recognized as kin to the mo'o, and in some cases, as Alohalani Brown explains, instead of having a fishtail, they may be reptilian below the waist. But in this case, they aren't. She isn't. In contrast to the best known man falls for mermaid scenario, which commonly entails violence as either the non-consensual abduction of the mermaid or the watery death of the man, here we have a young woman falling for a male water spirit, giving up her human ties of her own will and transforming into a fish-tailed woman. The young woman is much loved and admired. She's a punahele or favorite. And this matters because her opting for life in Honokabailani is not an escape from oppression or neglect. She cares about her mother and thus silently explains herself, but remains steadfast. She has made a choice, a transformative one, that does not diminish the mystery of the watery world or subordinates it to the human one. Her moving into a loving relationship with a water being is a transcultural transformation that is embodied and emplaced. That said, being open to other cultures also brings about loss, and not to the mother alone. Nakoa laments that pond is still here today as a kind of memorial for those days. However, it is not beautiful. In these days, it is crowded with dayflowers and various weeds. Come to think of it, it's very sad. Born in 1911, Nakoa first published the tale in 1979 and would have, as an adult, witnessed and grieved the heavy impact of post-statehood urbanization and highways on this natural swimming pool and more generally on this area of the island. The map I'm showing, dated 2011, can give you some idea of how the settler state's infrastructure and construction took over fertile land, polluted its waters, divided its people. This is not cultural exchange or harmony, but extraction and destruction of the ahupua'a and its ecosystem of humans and non-humans. What kind of a mermaid tale is this? Legend, myth as in Odysseus' encounter with the sirens, fairy tale as in Hans Christian Andersen's The Little Mermaid. Looking to the Hawaiian genre system that is thinking in emic terms, it is a mo'olelo. Aloha Lani Brown explains how the genre, termed mo'olelo, is capacious in that it encompasses and may incorporate and weave together elements from what in English would be termed story, history, myth, epic, legend, origin story, cautionary tale, folktale, and life writing. Brown continues, mo'olelo reflect a distinctly native Hawaiian approach to narration that builds on connectivity in its poetics and worldview, meaning that these stories are archives of philosophical thought, as they tell us how kupuna, or elders, theorized about the fundamental nature of knowledge, reality, and existence in connection with our island world, end of quote. But as some of my earlier research has shown, in the process of colonial translation, mo'olelo were reconfigured as fanciful legends and most of all as fairy stories, fictions of once upon a time. Furthermore, by this repackaging, which often masked adaptation as translation, assumed the centrality of Western thought and reality and subordinated indigenous knowledge to Western science. Such mythologizing, fellow folklorist Frog writes, builds on an implicit othering, or us versus them, an implicit othering approach, whereby, as I see it, colonial comparisons massage cognitive difference and willful ignorance into a hierarchical appropriation that purports to speak for the indigenous. As Cherokee author and scholar of First Nations and Indigenous Studies, Daniel Heath Justice puts it, for secular post-Enlightenment readers of the industrialized West, the very idea of spirit beings and little people, individualized and speaking animals, stones, plants with powers to shape the reality around them and motivations of their own, human actions changing the weather and affecting various elemental forces, and other worlds of beings and kinships with other than human peoples. All of these are the stuff of childish make-believe and even pathology, not generally understood as the mature experiential realities that they are in most traditional indigenous systems. Whether such narratives are traditional or new works of the imagination across media, Heath Justice proposes approaching them as indigenous wonder works, works that ground wonder in specific relationships of specific people to specific lands and histories, and that also offer an escape that presumes an ongoing engagement with the world, not a repudiation of or a removal from it. For Heath Justice, then, indigenous wonder works are rooted in the land, not generic landscapes, but specific places with histories, voices, memories. Applying this to Hawaii, Kualoha Ho'omanavanui states, Hawaiian wonder histories and stories that includes elements of wonder present engagement with the natural and spiritual realms as normal and part of our indigenous experiences or realities. And they inform an aloha aina, love of the land, political imaginary, the power to dream and imagine an anti-colonial, post-colonial existence as a celebration of who we are. So from a decolonial perspective, indigenous wonder works do not ask that we suspend disbelief. Rather, they are the creative actualization of long-held beliefs and ways of abiding in the world that patriarchal, colonial, white supremacist, and capitalist modernity have relegated to the past and dismissed as fantasy, but that nevertheless persist and reemerge in the present and for the future. Wondrous Mo'olelo, like indigenous wonder works more generally, depart from imitating a colonial consensus reality of everyday experience and activate the recovery of other ways of knowing and being as cultural resurgence. This is what motivates the collection of essays, creative writing, and artwork, An Ocean of Wonder, the Fantastic in the Pacific, that Kualoha Ho'omanabanui, Joyce Polani Warren, and I are working on. But let me return to The Mermaid of Honokawailani, which was recently retold and in an illustrated and bilingual book by the children of a Hawaiian language immersion school where Sarah Nakua was a beloved kupuna and elder. This is how the elementary students articulated their takeaway. The stories of these places are a lei or garland to cherish forever. But just like the mermaid, if these places disappear, they are never coming back. These children know that by telling and retelling the mo'olelo, the fragrance of Honokawailani lilies, and the multiple ways of aloha in the mo'olelo, especially its aloha aina, where issues of environmental and social justice merge, are not lost. Instead, they hold a place in the present and future of the people living in the islands today. That I am learning from Indigenous and Hawaiian studies, and that I'm opening myself up emotionally, intellectually to Hawaiian relational ontology and history does not in any way make me a mo'olelo expert. That is neither my responsibility nor right. But it has impacted my relationship to the folk and fairy tale, and my scholarship on the folk and fairy tale and its adaptation. As with other folklorists and fairy tale scholars, I strive for a rearticulation of the genre that does not subsume the indigenous into Euro-American storytelling modes, and instead considers the fairy tale as one of several wonder genres across cultures. We are increasingly aware of how, on the one hand, the literary fairy tale as a genre was imported from Europe via commerce and colonialism to other cultures. And on the other hand, many cultures have long had their homegrown or indigenous wonder genres. Donald Haase calls this decolonizing the fairy tale. Essays in Andrew Teverson's important 2019 volume, The Fairy Tale World, are especially persuasive in showing how fairy tales as quintessentially fictional narratives should not be equated with, and I may be mispronouncing these terms because I don't know the languages, should not be equated with ziguai, strange wonder ghost stories in Chinese traditions, Kurafa in the 1001 Nights, Insomi in South Africa, or Mo'olelo Kamahau, wondrous tales in Hawaii. All wonder genres that defy the fiction versus nonfiction divide in Western categorizing. And yet, as Teverson also points out, it is worth recognizing that Euro-American fairy tales have, in time and space, mingled with larger and varied traditions of belief, including myths, and have historically been associated with wonder as both transformative curiosity and humility. In the fairy tale world, the downtrodden make a better future for themselves, often thanks to being attuned to an all-animate world where humans and non-humans have reciprocal ties. When we consider the fairy tale as one of many wonder genres across cultures, we may better understand how some authors and artists in Oceania, for instance, are inspired to repurpose and thus change, even indigenize, fairy tales within their indigenous wonder works. All this has got me thinking about how important it is to recognize that there are multiple traditions of wonder, just as there are multiple fairy tale traditions, all of which, as folklorists know, change in time and space, are entangled in multiple story webs, speak for the concerns and values of those who tell them, and compete with one another to empowering and disempowering effects. In a recent study of fairy tales in contemporary American culture, Christine Moore-Koppy, a humanities professor at the New Economics School in Moscow, Russia, argues that Disney has successfully capitalized on the connection between its own transmedia adaptations of the genre and the American dream as the quintessential fairy tale. I agree with this assessment of the American mainstream fairy tale. However, Koppy goes on to state that because, I quote, Americans' exposure to fairy tales cuts across divisions of race, class, and faith, fairy tales have become our, meaning Americans, secular scripture, our primary narrative tools of cohesion, even though fairy tales do not represent the diversity of people present in the United States, end of quote. This acknowledgement that mainstream fairy tales do not represent the diversity of people present in the United States gives me pause and raises questions and concerns for me. How does that feel to these people? Do they want to recognize themselves in American fairy tales? What are the stakes of their changing these stories to represent themselves? How does the retelling of new and supplanted traditions of wonder change people's sense of what is possible, what is permitted, what is fair, and what is responsible or irresponsible? To begin addressing these questions in my talk, I visualize and thus recognize at least some other wonder traditions in the USA, making the mainstream hegemonic fairy tale just one of them. Obviously, the images on the slide do not account for the multiplicity of wonder tale traditions in American culture. Neither does this assemblage do justice to the cross-cultural encounters that shape these traditions, or to how they intersect and compete with one another in the imaginations and experiences of Americans. But I offer it as an assertion of how multiple traditions of wonder persist in the American imaginary, and as a call to consider how the power dynamics of each wonder tradition and fairy tale play out. In the interest of time, I will sketch 3 examples of these dynamics and then move to my final point. First, Disney's quintessential fairy tale world, experiences, and tales increasingly seek to extend their power by reaching out to audiences from a non-Euro-American background and cultures, and appropriating their traditions of wonder. As the film Moana exemplifies for the Pacific, to rather complex, extractive, emotional, and economic effects. Second, the colonial dynamics of transcoding and othering that I discussed in the Hawaiian context are quite relevant to understanding how, when the ancestor of today's The Rough-Faced Girl, Tale for Children, was collected by Anglo-Americans and Canadians in early 20th century editions of Native American tales, it was immediately recognized as a Cinderella tale. And in fact, at times titled An Algonquin Cinderella or the Indian Cinderella. Thus, a tale of Native American or First Nations ancestral knowledge became a fairy tale. To start grounding such a transformation in important historical and cultural specificities, I refer you to Indigenous Studies by Thomas King and Leanne Simpson, as well as to Jill Rudy's study, American Folklore Scholarship, Tales of the American Indians and Relational Communities in the Journal of American Folklore. As a result of colonial violence, generally speaking, the relationship of North American Indigenous storytellers to the fairy tale today is primarily to distance themselves from it as a fictional genre, at the same time that they recognize and leverage wonder as a powerful force in their own traditions. Third, as the editors of the recent annotated African American folktales, Henry Louis Gates Jr. and Maria Tatar note, Black folk narrative traditions have rarely been seen as culturally central to the American imagination. Furthermore, many Black people grapple with a history of fairy tale misrecognition. The role of the fairy tale princess is the most desirable in the hegemonic genre's script, but the classic magic mirror has projected the impossibility of that role for a Black woman. The controversy started in 2019 over Halle Bailey's being cast as Ariel in the still forthcoming live-action Disney remake of Little Mermaid, is symptomatic of rifts in American society and culture that are not so easily overcome. Countering this systemic racism, there has been some renewed attention to the African and African American traditions of water deities like Mami Wata, activating also the Black Mermaid or Simbi as both a site of traumatic memory and protector of women and children. It matters that these and other narratives intervene in the fraught relationship of African Americans to the Euro-American fairy tale at a time of heightened racialization and racism in the United States. The author of young adult novel Cinderella is Dead, Kaylin Barron, says in one interview, I'm drawn to fairy tales in general because I never saw myself in those stories and I really, really wish I had. In another interview, she says, I wanted to retell a story that was instantly recognized and deconstruct it in a way that centered the kinds of people who are nowhere to be found in the story itself, mainly Black, queer people. So I wrote the story that explores not only how fairy tales have the power to personally affect who we become, but also allows the reader to see this fairy tale world through the eyes of a young woman who is actively harmed by the societal norms the fairy tale itself perpetuates. End of quote. In the novel, another queer Black character, Luke, asserts, just because they deny us doesn't mean we cease to exist. Finally, and significantly, Cinderella is Dead can also be read as part of a wide-ranging counter-hegemonic tradition of children and YA retellings of fairy tales in North America that act on the genre's affordances as sites of wondrous possibilities and multiple alterities. And these are stories across media. While groups and individuals whom the Disneyfied fairy tale either does not represent or misrepresents will often turn away from the genre as normative pathway, they may instead, and often do, recognize the fairy tale as imaginative solution to problems experienced by those who are vulnerable or different, and they create new tales where wonder is mobilized to undo normativities. Whether they adapt a specific tale or repurpose the genre, These adaptations allow producers and receivers to experience and inhabit fairy tales anew, while returning to the understanding of them as dreams of justice. I find these activist fairy tale adaptations what Pauline Greenhill and I refer to in a recent article as fairy tale reanimations. I find them popping up everywhere and experimenting with possibilities, not just in one tradition or for children only. Heath Justice asserts that Indigenous wonder works invite us to think and imagine otherwise by grounding themselves in specific Indigenous histories, lands, and worldviews. In contrast, fairy tale forests, rivers, and oceans function as tropes that lack specificity, and while grounded in specific realities and desires, fairy tales travel across cultures. I wish to be clear, fairy tales are not Indigenous wonder works. That said, these wonder genres have not and do not exist in isolation from each other, and the violence that marked their relationship is not ontological. In opposition to the mainstream fairy tale, many of today's fairy tale adaptations and new fairy tales are also otherwise stories that choose wonder over magic. And their wonder activates curiosity, humility in the face of mystery, rethinking human, non-human relations, and engagement with possibilities outside of consensus reality. To reactivate the wonder spark of fairy tales, then, is to foreground that their journeys of recognition and transformation defy commonly accepted ideas of what's real or normal. And to recognize how the fairy tales make believe does not simply result in suspension of disbelief, but is sustained by wanting, needing to believe in alternatives to how things normally and often immorally work in the world. As a folklorist and cultural critic, I credit scholars from André Yolis and Max Luthi to Ernst Bloch, Jack Zipes, Sadhna Naitani, Marek Ozievich, and Pauline Greenhill, to name a few, for attuning me to how fairy tales can present a counter world, even a dream world of justice. From Indigenous wonder works, I'm learning how not to universalize one tradition of wonder and justice. And from contemporary counter-hegemonic fairy tales, I'm learning how the genre continues to change in the words and images of those who felt excluded or misrepresented in it. What comes forth to me then is how these wonder narratives and wonder genres, although often dismissed as primitive, childish, or escapist, can be central to imagining and making just and sustainable futures in the plural, and how much folklorists across the planet are in a position to help make that happen. Thank you. And here are some references, and I look forward to our discussion.